Welcome to a video for section 12.7 for Math 2, which is on the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is a really important formula to help you solve any quadratic equation. It needs to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So a is the coefficient of the x squared term, b is the coefficient of the x term, and c is the constant. And it is very important to note that it needs to be equal to 0. Once you have it set up like this, we can solve this equation. In other words, find what x or x's make this equation true using the quadratic formula. So there is a couple of different, well, let's first look at what it is, and then I'm going to tell you a couple of different ways to remember it. So first of all, it's negative b, or the opposite of b. So keep in mind, if b is negative, then that negative is going to turn it into a positive. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. So, what are some ways to remember this because it's so important? Well, there's a couple different songs you can use to help you kind of remember it. I don't know if you know of the song Pop the Weasel. I don't know the original words to Pop the Weasel, if there are any, but it goes dun 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 dun. You know that song, okay? So basically you sing the quadratic formula to the song Pop the Weasel. Okay? So let's give it a try. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There's another song that you can use. In fact, I think I know of at least 3. A second one could be the song Jingle Bells. Okay, it goes like this. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Hey! There's other ways to remember it, but those are a couple. So let's talk about the steps for how to use this formula. Probably the most important step to do in the beginning is make sure that you have your equation put into this form. And so that's step 1. Put the equation in standard form by setting everything equal to 0. We need the 0 there. No 0, not good to go. So then what you want to do is you want to identify the a, the b, and the c, the constants. Now, sometimes if you see just an x squared, that means that a is 1. If you don't see, maybe you'll see, let's just say 1x squared plus 2x equals 0, and so that 2 would be the b, but there's no c, well then that means the c is 0. So you have to keep in mind that if the term is completely missing, then that means that that number is a 0. If you see like a term there, but you don't see a number in front of it, like you see just like an x, then think there's a 1 in front. A, b, and c will never include any x's, okay? Or they're just constants. Okay. Then you plug in those numbers into your formula. So the first 3 steps are probably the easiest, and that's going to take you the least amount of time. The hard part comes when you simplify. And that's where mistakes are going to happen, and that's where it can get complicated. Now, how far you simplify is going to depend on if you're being asked to provide a decimal answer or a radical answer, so in a square root. So make sure to pay attention to the directions of the problem that you're given. All right, let's take a look at an example. It says solve, round to the nearest hundredth. So when they say this, then that means they're asking you for a decimal. And so I'm going to approach this a little bit differently in the last couple of steps. But let's go ahead and go through the first steps. Step 1 was to put the equation in standard form and set it equal to 0. So let's look at our equation. We have 3x squared plus 5x minus 4 is equal to 0. That is incorrect standard form, and it is equal to 0, and so I don't need to do anything. It's good to go. Okay, step 1 is done. Step 2, identify A, B, and C. I'm going to try and use the same colored highlighters here. So A is what goes in front of the x squared. So the A is going to be 3. Our B is what's in front of the x, that is a 5. And then our C is the constant, which is -4. Do take the negatives with it. Okay, so now we just have to plug those things in where they go. So remember, it's -b plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b goes in the first two spots that we're going to use here. So that's 5 in both places. Minus 4 times a times c, and then over 2a. So a goes in two places. A goes, so a is 3, and it's going to go here and here. And then finally we have c, which only gets plugged in once, and that's after the 4a under the radical, so 4ac. So that'd be the -4. Okay, so that's the first 3 steps. Like I said, that's really not the hardest part here. The hardest part and most of the work you're going to spend is simplifying this. You want to pay attention to order of operations and positives and negatives and lots of things like that. Alright, so let's continue on here. So the opposite of 5 is a -5, so that's just a -5 there. That part's easy. Most of the work is going to be under the square root. I do this in 2 steps. The first thing I do is I look at the squared and I square it. So 5 squared is 25. The next step, the next part of the square root is probably the place where most mistakes are going to happen. We have a -4. Think of that like a -4. I know it's subtracting, but think of it like a -4 and a 3 and another -4. So think of it like you're doing this. You're multiplying a -4 times a 3 times a -4. First thing I do is think about what is the sign of this answer going to be. This is a negative times a positive times a negative. That's going to give me a positive. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to have plus, and then 4 times 3 is going to give me 48. And then my denominator is going to be 2 times 3, which is 6. Okay, so then 25 plus 48, I just got to add that up. That's going to be 73. And then 6. Okay, so this is where it's going to vary from this step forward what you do next. Because they asked me for a decimal, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a calculator and I'm going to figure out what the square root of 73 is. Okay, so let's do that real quick. So taking the square root of 73, we get 8.54. Then since they wanted the 100th place, that's 2 decimal places. Okay, so I'm going to now break this up into 2 problems. Because there's a plus and a minus, that gives you 2 answers. So this is -5 plus, I already forgot what it was, 8.54, yeah, plus 8.54 divided by 6, and then -5 minus 8.54 divided by 6. And now we need to calculate those. Alright, so 8.54, if I'm going to add a -5, it's like -5 plus that is the same as subtracting 5. So I'm just going to subtract 5 and divide it by 6, and we get about 0.59. Okay, with the next one it's a little trickier. Let's clear this out. Alright, I'm going to start with a 5 negative. Then I'm going to subtract. I'm going to go back and do the square root of 73 again. And push equals. Then divide by 6. Okay, so that's -2.26. and these are my answers. Okay, I'm going to have you, I want you to pause and try this first couple of steps to this one. So set it equal to 0, find A, B, and C, and plug it in, and then see how far you can go. And then I'm going to do the end part, which is a little harder because this one asks us to leave it in simplified radical form. Okay, so pause it, do as much as you can, and then hit pause and or play, and then we'll see how you did. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is make sure that it's in standard form by setting it equal to 0. So we needed to add 3 to both sides first. So after we add 3, we get this. This is the standard form. Then we can identify A, B, and C. A turns out to be 1. Remember I said if you don't see a number in front of the x or the x squared, then that's a 1. B is -6 and C is +3. So plugging it all in, you get -6 plus or minus the square root of -6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 3 all over 2 times 1. So a -6 is going to turn into a +6. -6 squared is +36 minus 12. So then we get 6 plus or minus the square root of 24, all divided by 2. At this point, if we were just getting an answer that's a decimal, we would just go ahead and do what we did before, get a calculator, figure it out. But this one asks us for a simplified radical form. And so we need to recall how to simplify radicals. Okay, so first thing you do at this stage is find the square root look at the square root of 24 and ask yourself, can that be simplified? Indeed it can, because 24 is 4 times 6, and the square root of 4 is 2. So this is how we want to write the square root of 24. So this is going to become 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 6 all over 2. At this point, we want to look to see, basically I want you to look at 3 numbers. The 6, the 2, and the 6, or the 2. And ignore the radical. It's in a radical, we can't do anything with that. But look at the 6, the 2, and the 2, and ask yourself if there's a common factor. And I do see one. I see that on the top they both have their multiples of 2, and on the bottom we have a 2. So here's how we're going to do this. Break up this whole thing into 2 fractions so that we can reduce this. This is 3 over 1. This is 1 over 1. So this is really just 3 plus or minus the square root of 6. Now, just as a warning, there's something you're not allowed to do here. You're not allowed to just go and cancel these 2 and say, oh, that's a 3. You have to think about this one as well. And that's only if there's a number on the outside of the square root. It does not apply to this 6. Okay? And this is your simplified radical form answer.